All right, hello and welcome. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums. We are excited to have each of you with us today for today's History's Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And you can find all of our History's Lunches, previous and today's, on Facebook and YouTube afterwards. Well, I hope that you will join us this weekend at the Eudora Welty House and Garden for the heirloom plant sale at 9 a.m. on Saturday, March 29th. This event directly benefits the Welty Garden and is offered in partnership with the Eudora Welty Foundation. You'll also find Urban Foxes will be there on site selling coffee and snacks. Sales begin at 9 a.m. sharp, and these plants go fast. So if you're interested in participating, I encourage you guys to be there at 9 a.m. sharp. And then we hope you'll come back and join us next week where we will have History's Lunch on the legacy of Kirk Fordyce, his politics, his policies, and his people. But today we're excited to welcome Bill Crawford, a Canton native, who has had a diverse career spanning journalism, politics, banking, legislation, economic development, and community leadership, and playing a key role in keeping Meridian's Naval Air Station open. Bill is a college graduate of Millsaps, as well as a master's degree from Mississippi State University. He and his wife, Lynn, lived in Meridian for over 40 years before retiring to Jackson in 2020 to be closer to their grandchildren. Bill will be in conversation today with Luther Munford of counsel at Butler Snow, LLP, and an adjunct professor at Mississippi College Law School. He has had a distinguished legal career with a focus on judicial ethics, media representation. He is a Jackson native, and he has been involved in Mississippi politics, serving on judicial committees and working on Governor William Winter's 1967 campaign. He chaired the Mississippi Supreme Court Rules Judicial Conduct Committee in 2010, and his writings on law and society have been published in the National Law Journal, the American Bar Association Journal, and the Harvard Negotiation Law Review. You can find his columns currently on in the Northside Sun, so please help me welcome Bill Crawford and Luther Munford.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'd like to thank Drew and the Department of Archives and History for having us here today. I'd also like to give thanks to the University Press of Mississippi, which published this book. And I wanted to mention that in particular because some of you may know or not that before the University Press will publish a book, it has to have two outside independent reviewers give it a thumbs up. Well, one of those people that gave a thumbs up is Luther Munford. So he's partly responsible for me being here today. And again, thank you for being here. And now, Luther, you do your dirtiest.
This is a very unusual book. It really approaches the last several decades, I don't think I'm going to say how many, of Mississippi history from three different ways. Bill is a historian. It's history. He has been a participant in a lot of the events that have taken place in Mississippi politics over the last several decades, and he's got the participant's point of view. But the other thing is that he has been a journalist and has written about those events and has been bold enough to put in the book columns that he wrote when these events were taking place. So it's really a very unusual piece of history, and I do think it is, what did I say, wonderful? Yeah, I think.
He called it a wonderful book.
So, okay, we got questions. Your book is Republicans Lament, Mississippi Needs Good Government Conservatives. What is a good government conservative?
I'll have to start with a story. In 1972, I was copy editor at Daily Herald on the Gulf Coast, and I was writing all these headlines for this guy, Gil Carmichael, who was taking on Senator Jim Eastland for the U.S. Senate, and that fascinated me. skip ahead a couple of years, December of 74, and I got a meeting set up with Gil, and I went and told him, if you're going to run for governor, I want to work for you. So in January 75, I started to work with him. I was his only staffer for several months, was his aide, his driver, and his press secretary. So I got to know his vision of good government very well, because that's all he talked about. Okay. The rest of that story is then that I adopted that vision for my own, and it's guided my writings and my actions in government service, public service since then. So what did he mean? What was his vision for good government? There were several facets. One, he wanted to reorganize government. He believed that the office of governor should have more power. Those of you that studied the 1890 Constitution know that it deliberately diffused the power of the executive branch. Second, he wanted to, right-size state government. Too many agencies and different things that needed to be reduced so it could be more efficient. He believed, though, that it would take a new constitution to do both of those things. So he preached, particularly in 1975, the need for a new constitution in Mississippi. What he wanted to get out of those changes was an efficient and effective government. Okay, he thought that that would hold down taxes, help fund education and programs of that nature, as well as provide a reasonable safety net for the destitute. He wanted a strong two-party system. He believed that competitive politics would yield better policy for everybody. And he wanted to diversify the Republican Party. He believed that black and white ought to be working together, not at odds. I'll recognize Les Range in here, who's one of the early black Republicans that were part of that effort. So that basically gives you a sense of what good government was from Gil's vision.
And why are you lamenting?
Well, that takes another story. After I got involved in Gil's race in 75, I was editor of the Charleston Sun-Sentinel in Tallahatchie County. But I also kept engaged with the Republican Party, so they elected me county chairman in Tallahatchie County. At that time, they also put me on the state executive committee. So at that time, then chairman of the party, Charles Pickering, Gil, and others were traveling around the state saying, Democrats have held you to the bottom. Give us a chance and we'll get you off the bottom. Okay? 50 years later, Republicans have taken over, 2012 basically taken over state government, taken over more local governments. Yet, we're still on the bottom. There's a chart in here.
Pages 73 to 74.
Right, okay. That has 54 different categories that show us on the bottom or right on next to the bottom. Average wages, per capita income, academic investment, academic performance, all sorts of healthcare metrics, etc. Okay? So we're still on the bottom.
We're on the top on incarcerations per capita.
We're on the top in infant mortality deaths too, but I rate that as 50th. And the other thing I would point out is the cover, and you're going to talk about that maybe.
Yeah. Well, no.
You see
explain the cover. We had them put it up here.
You see the red counties and the blue counties. Those are not Republican and Democrat counties. The red counties are the 43 counties in Mississippi that the Census Bureau rates as persistent poverty counties. That means that for 30 years or more, 3 censuses in a row, they've had 20% or more of their population in poverty. Okay? So this is just added to my lament as to why I have a lament that we could have done so much better, in my opinion, but we have not.
So you dispute the claim that you quote from the Republican Party chairman in 2022 that Republican leadership was producing real results for our citizens?
Not exactly. There have been results, but they've not been sufficient to get us off the bottom. We've made a lot of progress in a lot of areas, okay? Average wages are up, okay? Schools are better. We're still on the bottom. We can do better.
Okay, well today, a lot of people in the Republican Party are don't believe in government. I mean, they think that Ronald Reagan was right when he said the worst words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." How can you still call yourself a Republican?
Well, you twisted that question. How can I call myself, how do you still call yourself a Democrat? You know,
I'm proud of the Democratic Party.
I remain a Gil Carmichael Haley Barbour Republican, just like I suspect you remain a William Winter Ray Mabus Democrat.
Oh, it's worse than that. I'm an Obama Democrat. He appointed Ray to be Secretary of the Navy. I'm on his team. Anyway, let's see. Okay, to frame this, why don't you tell us what you've done in government over the years so people will understand where you're coming from?
Okay, my first position in government was as a gopher for John Bell Williams in Washington during his last months before he became governor. And then his successor, Charlie Griffin, kept me on part-time, then full-time as a staff assistant, mostly handling constituent concerns. After that, I came back. I was working at the Clarion Ledger. David Hampton's back there, former Mr. Clarion Ledger. And they let me cover the state senate for the Clarion Ledger. So I would write about state politics covering the state senate. I mentioned, this is part of government, that in 1975 I was elected chairman of the Tallahatchie County Republican Executive Committee. Party executive committees are part of the government because they manage primaries. I was also on the state executive committee. I worked in Gil Carmichael's campaign in 75, worked in it again in 79, and after that moved to Meridian and was elected chairman of the Lauderdale County Republican Party and served on the state executive committee again. 1983, I was one of 6 Republicans elected to the House of Representatives, where I served from 84 to 88. And then in 92, where are you, Lisa? Governor Fordyce appointed me to the college board. She made it happen. And I served on the college board for 12 years, 92 to 2004. This counts as government. I was also vice president of Meridian Community College for 7 years. I was appointed by Governor Barbour then in 2004 as Deputy Director of the Mississippi Development Authority. At the local level, I was Chairman of the Council of Governments, Chairman of the Economic Development Authority, Chairman of the City Urban Renewal Authority, and also, as Luther mentioned, was head of the team that helped save Meridian Naval Air Station, where I had to work with a lot with federal officials and state officials to get that done. So I've been involved in federal, state, and local government over 50-something years.
You mentioned the college board. And in the book, you talk about your experience on the college board and the Ayers case and university consolidation. What's that story?
That's a long story. The month that I got appointed to the college board, the United States Supreme Court referred the Ayers decision back to Mississippi. We had not done enough to eliminate vestiges of segregation in this state. The entire 12 years I was on the board, that was an issue. We settled it, we thought, in 2000, but the settlement was not finalized until 2004. We met extensively to come up with plans trying to resolve the issues that we had. That's why we have today uniform admission standards at all 8 colleges. That was a requirement that the federal court put in place while we were doing there. We also had different plans looking at ways to enhance historically black universities to make them more competitive. One of the big issues we had from the Supreme Court, the 2 things that came out of their decision. One, they questioned whether 8 universities, the 8 that we had, channeled students and helped sustain, in effect, segregation, a vestige of segregation. And I just forgot the other one. Y'all have to bear with me. So we were working on plans. In the historically black universities had begun losing market share. More black students attending historically white institutions. We felt that they needed to be made stronger if they were going to compete for students, particularly for other race students, so they could have better market share. So we worked on plans for that, recommended some mergers, That got to court and failed. So then we decided, with strong push from Chancellor Caillat and President Portero at Mississippi State, to settle the case. Well, that proved difficult. There was no plaintiff to settle with until the court designated Benny Thompson as the representative of the plaintiff's class. So then we negotiated a settlement with him. I was part of those negotiations. Thought we had a settlement. It was going to be a great announcement for Mississippi settling the heirs case, and it took 4 more years for it to finally be settled because people kept taking it to court, arguing this, arguing that. So it finally settled. So that was the main thing that my term on the college board was focused on.
Well, I don't think you've told us why you got called Mississippi's most bigoted and rednecked man.
Well, you can imagine, but I will read that entire thing to you. William S. Crawford, you are the undisputed winner of the title, Mississippi's most bigoted and redneck man, by the hordes of people who utterly despise you from Alcorn State University, Jackson State University, and Mississippi State University. It was a caricature of a Klansman, and I received that in 1995. And that came, as you can imagine, because we had considered closing and merging universities.
Uh-huh.
That's why I got it.
Because you wanted to close Valley.
That was
And the W.
Those we both recommended closure and recommended merger, depending on which scenario you want to talk about. So that's what I am, guys.
Well, you mentioned the delay of the settlement because of litigation. What problem did that cause?
Well, the settlement didn't get concluded. It had been the attorney for the plaintiffs, original attorney for the plaintiffs.
But wasn't there something about money? That there was some money that was going to be available initially and that didn't get made available until later?
No, that's something else.
Okay.
No, this was a complaint. The attorney for the one, I think it had something to do with legal fees.
Uh-huh.
But second, the attorney for the plaintiffs was not happy with the settlement. Benny obviously was not able to get everybody on board to what he was agreeing to. So several of the plaintiffs, including Mrs. Ayers, pursued further litigation. Mm-hmm. They challenged it in court all the way back up to the Supreme Court and finally got a decision that the settlement was okay. Mm-hmm. That's what delayed it.
I see. Well, what was the money angle?
The money angle came later. Part of the settlement offer at the time we were doing it was that the state would put up about $70 million in endowment for the historically black universities, and we thought, actually, Portero and Caillat thought, because they were pushing for the settlement, that they could raise another $30 million in private funds for the endowment. And at that time, it was still the dot-com pre-bust time, and they thought there would be plenty of money for that. When it didn't settle, the dot-com bust came. Interest, the sense that Mississippi was finally doing something had dissolved into, they're still fighting, they're still arguing, they hadn't solved anything. So what we thought would be a big boom to bring in money went away. Robert was able to ultimately raise $1 million for that, and the rest of it was never raised.
Well, you write about something that's not controversial at all called the Public Employees Retirement System. What was your take on that?
Well, I called it political.
You're a banker. You ought to know something about debt.
Well, I was also on the Barber's Per Study Commission.
Okay.
But what I did was I called what they were doing up till this time anyway, political insanity. So let me read something to you. At the end of 2022, 10 years after Haley questioned the viability of the retirement system, the PERS board voted to increase the employer contribution rate by another 5% to 22.4%. That was 10.4% higher than the level in 2011 when Haley appointed his study committee. The increase was due to take effect in October of 23, but legislative leadership pressured the PERS board to delay it. PERS pushed back the date to July 1, 2024. Then in August 2023, it lowered the increase to 2%, but projected that something similar would be likely in coming years. And it's less than that now in what they're doing. The recommended increase was the fourth time the board and its advisors contended an increase would solve PERS funding shortfall. The early ones did not, and PERS instability worsened. Albert Einstein says the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing expecting different results. This was a perfect example of that.
I think you say that at one point there were 2.5 employees for every retiree, and now we're down to like 1.1 or 1.2 employees per retiree.
And it's worse than that now. I don't have the latest statistic. Y'all understand this text was finished in early 2023. Wasn't it?
You talk about trying to get more black people involved in the Republican Party. Tell us about that.
Well, that was, Gil and the party's effort in the late 70s, early 80s to do that. They actually went and met with Democratic leaders, Aaron Henry and others, trying to recruit people to get involved at that time. That wasn't doing real well, and as I was chairman of the Republican Party in Lauderdale County, we were successful in recruiting black members of our executive committee. But at the state level, nothing was happening. It was very frustrating. So I wrote a letter to then Chairman Mike Retzer, copied to Thad Cochran, who was also wanting to change things. That was, in my inimical style, pretty outrageous. Saying if you expect to recruit black people to the party, you can't have a lily-white, racist executive committee for the state. Okay? That was a private letter. Somebody gave it to the Memphis Commercial Appeal, and it became a huge furor. Thad said he liked my recommendation, but it still took him 3 more years, I think it was 3, before they were able to add black members of the executive committee. One of those was one I had recruited in Meridian at that time, Eugene Young.
Mm-hmm. You said you have a story about Gil Carmichael persuading Robert Clark to endorse him?
Well, something like that. I'll read that part too, because it's pretty good. Where is that? There it is. Well, I thought it was right there. Well, it's not there, but he did, and I was going to try to quote, but I don't have it. There's an excellent oral history of Robert here at the Archives and History Department, and he talked about this at the time in 1975, that he had always wanted for gubernatorial candidates to come ask him for his vote, and nobody was doing that. They didn't seem to want his people among the white politicians, and Gil was the first one to come to him and say he wanted his vote. And so after that, Robert agreed to serve as co-chairman of Democrats for Carmichael in 1975.
Huh. Isn't that interesting? That's quite a twist on current politics. You say that race is an essential issue in Republican strategy today. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's not exactly right. What I've talked about is that, let me say this instead. One of the things I write about in the book, there are 3 behaviors, I think, that help hold us on the bottom. They're called, I call them Faulkner's curse, the double whammy, and political insanity, which I've already mentioned to you. What is Faulkner's curse? Well, in The Bear, one of his characters says, the South is forever cursed, and it was a metaphor for continued racism, et cetera, in the South. And so what I talk about are vestiges of that in here. And the party and people in Mississippi, the Mississippi people have moved off mostly from the rampant racism of the old days, okay? But what's left? We still have instances, vestiges of segregation. We saw it in the flag fight for many years. You know, it was an issue that black people particularly wanted changed, and the party fought against it, although it ultimately was Republican leaders that changed the flag. Since then, we had thought we were on the right track in Mississippi. Then things seems to change. The DEI fight that's been going on, things from the national party that seem somewhat racist today. So race remains a powerful force in politics, not only in Mississippi, but in the nation. And so that's what I'm talking about.
Why do you say DEI is a fake issue?
I said it was for Mississippi. Auditor Shad White was pushing that, okay, and talking about stuff that the Florida governor was talking about nationally. But in Mississippi, if you listen to the presidents of universities, what they were doing is nothing like that. At Mississippi State in particular, they were working with veterans. They were working with international students. They were working with first-time college goers out of families, helping them transition, helping them learn how to get along with people. That's not what the national issue was, and so that's why I wrote about that.
So you thought it was fake in Mississippi?
Pardon?
You thought it was fake in Mississippi?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's why Shad White called you an aging white liberal.
I guess that's why he called me that.
Yeah, well, like me, you're aging in white, but I don't call you liberal.
Well, that's an interesting term now. I wrote about it this past week. The head of the Mississippi Institute of Public Policy, or Center for Public Policy, they've been championing the House position on the tax cut, and they were writing about that, and they're saying that liberal Delbert Hosemann and senators are holding it back. Liberal Delbert, he was for tax cuts, he was for all that kind of stuff. And so if that's liberal, then I guess I'm liberal. Okay.
And I'm not. Oh, boy. Yeah, you call the Mississippi Center for Public Policy a truth management organization?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I wrote about it a good bit. You know, this is not something brand new. Our Defense Department has practiced truth management over the years. Propagandists practice truth management. It's a technique where you tell the part of the truth that serves your need, but not necessarily the whole truth. Now, in recent history, as new organizations have sprung up to promote conservative or liberal policy, this is on both sides. These organizations start out with a bias, and so they tell the truth related to what they're interested in. And so that's what I was primarily talking about with the Center for Public Policy. They did call me, the research director did call me a liar one time, but
Call you a what?
a liar.
A liar?
A liar.
Not telling the truth?
Uh-huh.
Goodness gracious.
That's what. So, but anyway, that's what I was writing about. Their positions focus on the strategies or the politics that they want, and sometimes they exaggerate that. But research institutions, particularly charitable ones in my mind, should be giving facts and information and let others draw the conclusions about what that shows. Used to be, my understanding of the Brookings Institute way back, that's what they did, a real research organization.
You obviously have personal stories in here. One of them was about a woman who actually lived down the block from me named Mary Brooks. What was her influence in your life?
I'm going to read that to you.
Okay.
I like reading what I wrote because what I write is better than what I say.
Her husband was a doctor at the medical school, I
Dr.
believe.
Tom Brooks, a
Yeah.
blood specialist. Here we go. There was a time of enlightenment for me when this very different teacher showed up to teach us American history at Canton High School. Of course, that's a very impressionable time in anyone's life, and of course, those were heady days in America, days of change, of idealism. But what implanted itself on my psyche was a direct result of both your teaching and your example. I have trouble putting it into words. I suppose you could call it the birth of social consciousness. I was learning new ways to consider ideas. You were the first teacher outside of math and science to challenge us to reason. Most other social science classes focused on learning. There's a chasm between learning and reasoning.
That's quite a tribute. Quite a tribute.
She had quite an impact.
Another person that you speak highly of is a politician named Haley Barbour. Why do you think Haley Barbour was a good guy? Besides, other than the fact he appointed you to an office.
Well, I could simply just say Katrina. His work that he did after Katrina to bring us back. He was here recently and talked about that and compared us, say, to Louisiana in terms of what got done. You know? And he was the leader behind that. He didn't do it all, but he was the leader behind it. But I got to work with Haley for many years in Republican Party things. And I found one thing, Ron Haley is brilliant. He's very pragmatic and can make decisions that aren't necessarily ideological positions. Very effective at getting things done, and was also charismatic. So I thought he was a tremendous leader, still do. I don't agree with him on everything, but he did give me a job, one that I wasn't looking for. So I have great respect for Haley.
And I will say that I consider the fact he gave you a job to be something in his favor. That he was smart enough to hire a good fellow. This book has a lot of interesting facts that you dig up. You have a talent, I guess because you've been involved in government, you have a talent for going and finding interesting facts. One was about the income gap between black households and white households between 1999 and 2021.
Well, that's part of writing about, why we're still on the bottom and what needs to be done to fix things. My aptitude is really in math. I have a degree in mathematics. I'm fond of logic. But also, as I was talking earlier, what I think research organizations and people ought to do is research the facts and let that support your arguments, not just spew facts out there. And so my writing reflects that. I try generally to have facts and information that back up what I'm saying, not just an opinion. And so that is true in most of my writings.
Well, what was this income gap deal? It was that both black and white incomes have doubled.
Yes.
But that means the gap has doubled too.
The gap doubled too. That's correct.
That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And you say that 53% of all black undergraduates in the state now attend majority white universities. Is that right?
No, I didn't say that. I said at the
say?
time I wrote the book.
Oh, at the time you wrote the book.
That's right. And that's part of what I was talking about, the market share for black students. The white universities have taken over the market share. How do we make the historically black institutions more competitive for other students?
I want to point out that I've spent some time with the Mississippi Constitution and the education parts, and you found something that I didn't realize, which was the Constitution says the legislature shall establish public schools, but it then says the local districts may levy a local tax, but yet the legislature seems to want to put the burden on the local people rather than as much the state people.
One of my arguments is based on that constitutional language is the state ought to take more ownership of schools and education in the state. School buildings, for example, most of those are funded through local taxes, not state taxes. The legislature gives money for facilities to universities and community colleges, but seldom for high schools and schools. The current formula, the new formula that we've got adopted, I believe, requires local government to put up 27% match to get the state funds. That's not may, that's shall. Mm-hmm. And so basically they pushed more and more of the cost of education to the local level. And I think that's part of the reason why we have struggled to get our schools better. Now we're doing some better, but there's still a lot of facilities that need to be updated or replaced.
No.
And education is the foundation for prosperity. Nobody argues about that. So that's a Republican philosophy, in my opinion, that we ought to be investing in infrastructure and talent in public schools. We still have trouble recruiting teachers to many of our schools.
You don't shy away from controversy.
I don't run toward it, but I don't shy away from it.
You criticize our Congressman Guest, for saying we ought to defund the Internal Revenue Service?
Something like that. I did write a column about it. Let me see what I did say. Well, where is it? Well, the title of the column was whether to catch or not catch cheaters. Okay, I'll have to just tell you. What he said, there was a bill in the Congress to add 70,000, 7,000, some number of agents to the IRS. And what he wanted and others to do was to defund those additions to the IRS. That was to help them, one, collect taxes from people that weren't paying their taxes, and second, to give them more resources to answer taxpayers' questions when they have concerns or questions. And so part of the push for the party that I don't understand is wanting to stop the IRS from collecting taxes based on tax laws that they've passed. Seems like they would want to enforce their own laws. So yes, I did write about that.
You would think. One thing we haven't mentioned was something called the Montgomery Institute in Meridian. What was that? Or what is that?
It is a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization that I founded in the year 2000.
And?
I've been very active in Meridian community development and things of that nature, and one of the issues we noticed through a Ford Foundation grant that we had was that for Meridian to prosper, the region needed to prosper. And so we thought it would be good to form an organization similar to the Create Foundation, but without a newspaper in its pocket, to try to work in the region and make the region more prosperous. And so with help from the Rush Foundation, not the Riley Foundation, Meridian, we created the Montgomery Institute that initially started working with every county touching Lauderdale County in East Mississippi and West Alabama. Over time, it would expand depending on grants or resources we had, and other times it would shrink. But my time there was split. I was there 2000, 2004, then worked for Haley for 4 years, then came back. During my time there, we brought in about $40 million working with colleges, community colleges, schools, hospitals, civic organizations, others, to help them innovate and try to address issues to make them better off. Our motto for the Montgomery Institute is upbuilding people in places. Upbuilding people in places.
What's its budget, or has its budget been in the past?
It just varies.
Uh-huh.
Okay, we were very good at attracting grants to do a lot of these things.
Uh-huh.
The biggest was $15 million. The smallest was about $200,000. So it just varies. Right now, the focus is more on healthcare related issues in the area because that's proven to be a significant need in the area. Both of our hospitals a number of years ago said they were going to have to close their emergency rooms because they were losing so much money. So we started something called the Community Health Improvement Network to try to address that. That network has grown into the main mission of the Institute these days, and it's doing a very good job as I understand. Mm-hmm. And they work also outside of Lauderdale County.
We've kind of skipped over the fact that you have been a journalist. Tell us about your journalism career and why you're still writing those columns.
It's my hobby. I don't charge for my columns. Now, I will say that when I started back in 1978 in North Mississippi, there were no columnists, hardly any from up in that region. Paul Pittman was from South Mississippi. Bill Miner was from Jackson. So I thought I'd write a column. And so I would send out a column to 22 newspapers, mostly weekly newspapers, and charge them $2 a week. Okay, $2 a week. And that was my start. I've been writing this current column since 2009, and I did it more as a give back to newspapers rather than trying to make money. Back then, David Hampton was running my column in the Clarion Ledger, and he tried to pay me one time, and I refused. It's just a calling I have.
Very interesting story. At the end of your columns, you quote Bible verses. Why do you do that, and where do you get those verses?
In the Bible. In 2019 or so, in my faith journey, I got to the point where I thought it was more important to exhibit my faith rather than just have faith. And I decided that adding verses to the end of my columns, which is somewhat controversial, was a way for me to provide testimony of my faith. So that's why I started. And I researched, the Bible to find different ones at different times. It seemed related to what I'm writing about, but not necessarily to justify what I'm writing about. You ready to quit yet?
Yeah, let's let these people ask some questions.
Yeah.
All right, we've got plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to come around with the mic. I know we had an early question that was requested before we even got started. It wasn't you? Oh, there you go. Sorry.
Why do you think the legislature has been reluctant to repair the referendum? That's the question.
Threat to their power, the bottom line. That's the only reason I can think of. It was hard to get that opportunity to have referendums, and then it was killed on a technicality, basically. And they don't want to give up power on several issues to the people. I'll just remind everybody that the Constitution gives the power to change the Constitution to the people, explicitly. But the legislature refuses to give them a means to do that. And so right now, you couldn't change it if you wanted to.
And the bills that...
Pardon?
Is that lamentable?
Is it amendable?
Lamentable.
Lamentable, yes.
And the bills that have been floating around recently don't amend the Constitution. Well,
No.
they let the legislature change whatever's going to happen.
They would require changes or creating new statutes.
Right.
They
Not the
did come back and say they couldn't change it back for 2 or 3 years, but they could always change the statute back.
Yeah, and that's not what a Constitution's for.
No.
Okay, question over here.
Hey, Les.
Hi. Your lamentation about the Ayers case, you discussed it somewhat here today, but at the end of that section, you said that you were naive in terms of what your expectations were. Why did you invest so much capital, political capital, personal capital, in trying to bring about a good solution in the Ayers case?
I didn't realize I had all that much capital. My motivation was, and I wrote about this, Daily Herald asked me to write a column on it in 1995, was could we find a way to bridge the gaps between black and white? Was there any way to honor the history of historically black institutions and yet move them to a more competitive future? And so that was my motivation, and I wrote about that in the letter to Mary Brooks, for what I tried to do, the small role I played. I was one of 12 on the college board. One of my laments is that what we ended up doing has not worked. And I write about that in here. But that was my motivation, Les.
I have a two-part question. One is if we all understand that education is important for the nation's prosperity, then why is the current Republican Party allowing the attack on the Department of Education now? And two, in passing the responsibility down to state and local, how is it that those of us who were subjects of restricted educational experiences supposed to trust it? I definitely do not trust Mississippi being responsible for my education.
The first part about the Department of Education, I'm not plugged into national politics with the party. This came up in the 1990s. The Contract for America proposed closing the Department of Education. It did not happen. You know, I can't speak really to the motivations of the party. You'll have to ask someone else that question. I can understand your concerns about trusting the state, but I will say the state's doing better. It can do a lot better, but it is, I think, doing better.
Bill, you were on the Mississippi Development Authority Board?
No, didn't have a board. I was deputy director.
Deputy Director. What sort of scorecard would you give to the MDA over the last 2-3 decades? We've had some successes, but there's been some spectacular flops, too.
Yes, and that is the nature of economic development, is you shoot the arrow and you hope to, you know, kill the elephant or whatever you're shooting at, and sometimes it wasn't worth shooting. It's been mixed, okay? Governors tend to control those. Some have hired professionals to run them, others have not. You know, right now we seem to be landing a whole bunch of prominent industries right now. I don't know how much of that we attribute to MDA or not, because I'm not part of it. Hopefully they're very involved, and I know they're involved in helping make the deals come true. I don't know about how we get the industries interested in us. But economic development agency like MDA, very diverse organization. You have recruiting industry internationally, you have recruiting industry internationally, you have helping existing businesses expand and do better. You had focus, it handles all sorts of federal grants that come in to the state, CDBG grants and other grants of that nature. It has special programs for minority businesses. It has had tourism as a major piece. That's fixing to move, it seems like, to an independent organization. So it's a complex agency, and I've never tried to score it, really. It's a non-answer.
This is really a follow-up on Annie's question. I can understand where you're looking at the W and at historically black colleges and universities, that if they are not competitive, they can cease to exist. I can also understand there being institutions that are fundamentally dedicated to populations that have historically been discriminated against. And so I'm sure that that was a lot of discussion, and I'd sort of like to know where you draw that line, since obviously if they become more competitive, they become less of what they are as well.
Hard to draw that line. I'll tell you this story. You know, at the time we were doing AERS, okay, looking at closure emergency of universities, I was back in Meridian defending Naval Air Station to keep it open from closure, okay? And I'll tell you this distinction. The way we went about it in Meridian is we never attacked another base or anything, and we told the Defense Base Closure Commission, if it's the right thing to close us, if the evidence and the data says close us, close us. Here's what we think the data really says, okay? We never kind of got that input from the colleges when we were taking a look at that. Basically, we were up against a situation where and not going to diminish this in any way, historically black colleges weren't looking for remedies for the future. They were looking for justice from the past. And that made it hard to move to the future, okay? When Alcorn State University saying you need to give us the land grant mission for Mississippi State, okay? You can, huge cost to make some change of that nature. So those were the sorts of things that we were dealing with. The case of the W was really a financial argument at the time we were looking at it. We had been making budget cuts at the state level. We didn't have a pot of money. And so if we were going to enhance the historically black institutions, where was it going to come from? The W was a potential source if you close the W. Not at all about whether it was doing a good job or a bad job. And if I put my other hat on, I'm somebody in Columbus trying to defend the institution, I would be just as adamant as they were, because it's a vital part of their community. It's an economic engine. So I'm glad I don't have to make those calls today. But if you're at the state level trying to be efficient and effective, you look at it one way. If you're at the local level trying to protect things that you've invested in as a part of the community, you have a different vision. And those things clash often. And how they're resolved in the right way is the great challenge. And seldom in Mississippi do we resolve them well. That's what my book says.
Hi, there's been a migration of black students to predominantly white schools since the 70s. A migration of black students to white schools since the 70s. You said, I think you just said there's 53% of high school students who go now to predominantly white schools. In your research, how many white students go to HBCUs? If you didn't say it in your research, what's your guess?
Well, what I can say is this. One of the things we put in place in the heir settlement to get access to the endowment funds was that the historical black institutions would get control of those funds if they hit a 10% other race number, okay? Over time, each one of them has hit it, but none have sustained it. So basically, I know it's pretty much less than 10%. It may be something different right now, but in terms of ability to sustain that other race enrollment, it's not been very good.
Thank you. If one looks at that map, Mississippi, in the northwestern area, the Delta area, agriculture, cotton production was the main economic activity up until the Civil War. And that agriculture, that production of cotton made Mississippi the richest state in the Union up until the Civil War. After the Civil War, cotton productions declined. Mississippi no longer was the richest state in the Union. And as that went on, that over the years, migration, diversification of agriculture, mechanization caused further decline, and as you rightly say, Mississippi is at the bottom of the economic table in terms of the states in the United States. I would argue that if you were to bring back some economic growth and development to that area that has become the persistent poverty area in the Delta, if you were to bring back some agricultural activity and diversify it and cause the unemployment that is there and the land that is there that is available, if you were to get investments in that area, I think that would make a big improvement in not only the economy of the Delta, but the economy of the state. And I think that would cause an improvement from the bottom towards at least even not to the top, but at least to the middle. So, and if you were to put on your banking cap or your economic development cap, what would you say about investments in the Delta area to improve the economy of the state and to improve the economy of the area there?
Well, I would say that that's a challenge, and there have been attempts to do that over the years, and it's not happened. What I would point out, though, is that what has been going on in the Delta, if you look on the right-hand side of the state, you see more and more red counties over there. And these are mostly rural counties in Mississippi that now have higher levels of poverty. One of the things that's been going on has been a transition in the state in the rural counties. One of the things I write about in the book that I lament is that we do not have well thought out policies for rural Mississippi. We focus on the whole state. Virginia and states of that nature have organizations that focus on rural policy. How do you address brain drain in rural counties? How do you address the economy in a county that's lost its basic manufacturing jobs, which has been going on in the Delta for quite a while? How do you get investment into those areas and create opportunities? Or are we going to do like some of the novelists of the past write about, we're going to all cluster to metropolitan areas and live in these skyscraper buildings. And then everything outside of us will be mechanized farming, things of that nature. Is that where we're going? If we're not investing in rural areas and finding ways to make economies work there, and I'll veer off again, what has been a major economic engine in most communities that have them? Hospitals, okay? And what are we not supporting well these days? Hospitals. In Lauderdale County at one point, I don't know what it is today, 1 out of 5 jobs was healthcare related, 20% of the economy, okay? Both of those hospitals have had to merge with bigger institutions to survive. This is going on across Mississippi. Some places are getting great industries and doing tremendous. Other places are just drying up. And if we don't have policies to address that, nothing's going to stop it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming up to the top of another hour. But before we wrap up, Bill and Luther, if you guys will just give us one quick, we've told us a lot of stories from the book, a lot of things that they'll find, but give us one last quick 30-second pitch. Why should somebody go and pick up the book and read it today?
Because University Press of Mississippi wants to sell books. And they're a good organization.
And we believe in the University of Mississippi Press.
Well, we're going to leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give another round of applause for Luther Munford and Bill Crawford. We have copies of the book over at the table. You guys can see Courtney. You can get a copy signed. If you have questions for Bill or Luther, they'll be around to ask questions. And we hope you'll be back with us next week for the legacy of Kirk Fordyce, his politics, his policies, and his people. Thank you guys so much.